exploring the artistic and cultural interchanges of societies along the so-called Silk Road.
This to my, sorry. Thank you. So to follow Paul's analogy, we're now excavating back in time to Zoroastrianism, because although it's the last religion on this program, it's most likely the earliest of these religions, and this makes it the oldest living religion today. We can trace Zoroastrianism back to the second millennium BCE with the Iranian tribes living in Central Asia, well before some of these tribes moved south onto the Iranian plateau, establishing the Median and then the Achaemenid empires in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. And this is just about 100 years before the Buddha was born in southern Nepal, just to put it into some perspective. Zoroastrianism is the dominant religion of the pre-Islamic Iranian world, which in addition to present-day Iran included the former Soviet Central Asian republics of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. And you've seen various depictions of the Silk Road map. So you're quite familiar with this by now, I'm sure. But these stands in pre-Islamic times corresponded to the regions of Khwarezmia and Sogdiana. And it was the people living there, and in particular the Sogdians, who from the 4th to the 9th century of our era brought the religion along the caravan roads that traversed the mountains and deserts of Central Asia into China. With the coming of Islam, which Paul, I think, has very masterfully traced for you, Zoroastrianism became marginalized and can no longer really be considered a Silk Road religion. Its locus shifted from Iran and Central Asia to India, where its followers are the Parsis. Today there are an estimated 200,000 Zoroastrians worldwide. The majority are still in India, concentrated in Bombay, but sizable communities exist in Iran, Britain, the United States, Canada, the Gulf states, and Australia. Zoroastrianism is also referred to as Mazdaism, after the old Iranian term Mazdayazna, which literally means he who sacrifices to Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda being the supreme Zoroastrian deity. And hovering above the map is Ahura Mazda as the Achaemenid Persians visualized him, a crowned and bearded half-figure emerging from a winged sun disk. And you see him again on the facade of the Achaemenid king Darius's rock-cut tomb at Naqshi-Rustam in southwestern Iran. The king stands on a step platform and raises his right hand in prayer towards the god. Opposite the king is also a step platform on which you see an altar with fire burning that is sacred to Ahura Mazda. Now, if we flash forward about 1,000 years, and at the same site, Naqshi-Rustam, you see on the right Ahura Mazda, now in westernized, fully human guise, seated on horseback and investing the first king of the Sasanian dynasty, Ardashir, with the right to rule. You see he hands him a ribboned ring, and there's Ardashir in this very elaborate crown. Both are on horseback, and both trampling their respective enemies, which I will get to. Zoroastrianism was the official religion of the Sasanians, who held sway from the first quarter of the 3rd century to the coming of Islam in the mid-7th century in an area that extended from present-day Iraq into Afghanistan. This is the period reaching well into the 9th century when Zoroastrianism was carried and practiced along the Silk Road into China, where we have strong evidence for it among its Iranian adherents and some evidence of it among the Chinese themselves, notably members of the royal households. But before saying more about Zoroastrianism on the Silk Road and showing its visual manifestations there, I'd like to tell you something more about the religion itself. Much of what we know about Zoroastrianism at this time comes mainly from Iran. Now, this is a little difficult. It skews our knowledge because just about all of the Zoroastrian texts that have come down to us reflect the religion as it was practiced in Sasanian Iran, not elsewhere in the greater Iranian world. To complicate things further, these texts were not written down until the 9th century and even later, well after the Sasanian dynasty no longer existed. So to talk about Zoroastrianism on the Silk Road, we need to focus on the religion as it was practiced by the Sogdians, whose homeland, Sogdiana, lay mainly in Transoxiana between the two great rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, known in ancient times as the Oxus and the Jaxartes. It is here that we find the ancient Sogdian sites of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Tashkent, along with others that are less well known and are now only archaeological sites. It was the Sogdians, with their vast trading network, who dominated the east-west trade, establishing communities across Xinjiang, the Gansu corridor, and into northern and central China. And I should add too, although I'm talking about Zoroastrianism, it was the Sogdians who translated many of the Buddhist texts that were carried from India into China. And you're looking at just two Chinese renditions from different Chinese tombs of Sogdian merchants, which illustrate the Chinese saying, "Men of Sogdiana have gone wherever profit is to be found." And because they were such master traders and went everywhere, the Sogdian language became the lingua franca of the Silk Road. That said, what are the main beliefs of Zoroastrianism? First, it's a revealed religion based on the teachings of its prophet, Zarathustra, known to the Greeks and to us in the West as Zoroaster. A poet and a priest, Zoroaster appeared among the Iranian pastoralists of Central Asia at a time which is much disputed by scholars, ranging from as early as the mid-second millennium to as late as the 6th century BCE. But regardless of the date that is assigned to him, Zoroaster reformed the religious beliefs and practices of his community, and in particular elevated one god above the other deities of the old Iranian pantheon. And that god is Ahura Mazda, the all-knowing ruler. This gives a monotheistic cast to the religion, but at the same time, Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion because Zoroaster placed another deity in opposition to Ahura Mazda, Angra Mainyu or Ahriman. Ahriman represents the force of evil in the universe, and we come back to the relief of Ahura Mazda and King Ardashir, on which you see Ahriman being trampled by Ahura Mazda's horse. And you notice instead of hair, he has a nest of writhing snakes, snakes being a very noxious animal to Zoroastrians. And so it's these two forces, good and evil, order and chaos, the truth and the lie, that Zoroastrians believe vie for the human soul, and it is their combat that shapes the destiny of the world. This is an important distinction between Zoroastrianism and many other revealed religions, unlike Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which present a perfect world created by God and then is beset by evil. Zoroastrians recognize that good and evil have existed from the very beginning. Ahura Mazda and the forces of good, that is, other deities who coexist with him, are constantly in opposition with evil. And it is the same on earth. Zoroastrianism holds that people are essentially good, but are always in danger of being taken over by evil. In addition to elevating Ahura Mazda and viewing him in opposition to Ahriman, Zoroaster designated the other deities of the old Iranian pantheon as good or as bad. The bad ones became the Deebs, or demons, who chose to side with evil and worked to convince mankind that Ahura Mazda is not the true ruler of the universe and that order is not good. It is this notion of the Deeb that has influenced our concept of the devil and is in fact the origin of our word. It is this dualism which is both cosmic, representing the ongoing battle between good and evil within the universe, and moral, the opposition of good and evil in the human mind, that underlies Zoroastrianism's concern with purity and pollution. To Zoroastrians, the four elements, fire, earth, water, and air, are sacred, and many practices and rituals are performed so as not to defile. Many people now consider Zoroastrianism a very green religion. Two of these elements and the rituals associated with them figure prominently as we follow Zoroastrianism along the Silk Road, and they are fire and earth. Fire, which is sacred to Ahura Mazda, is not worshipped, but offerings are made to it, and it acts as an intermediary between the worshiper and God. Fire transports the worshipper's offerings to Ahura Mazda and to other benevolent divinities, and in turn, fire brings the gifts of the gods to the worshipper. The Sasanian kings established fire temples throughout their realm for the worship of Ahura Mazda and other divinities, and you see a reconstructed Atashka, or place where the sacred fire would have been kept. There would have been a building around it, and this is from Iran. And over here is actually a colored photograph of a Parsi temple in Bombay, and you see the fire burning in the inner sanctum. And up here is a Sasanian fire altar is represented on one of the coins, not too far different from the fire altar that you had seen on Darius' tomb. In Sogdiana, we also have remains of fire temples, and in addition, images of priests tending the sacred flame. And on the left, you see two priests to either side of a fire altar of the same step variety that you saw on the coin. They hold fire tongs and with their raised arms fuel the sacred flames. They're dressed in long robes, and they wear a cloth called a padam that covers their nose and their mouth to avoid defiling the fire with their breath. And you see the same very similar depiction in this photograph of a modern-day Parsi priest. The relief that you're looking at is from one of the sides of a clay bone receptacle or ossuary that contained the bones of the deceased after exposure to flesh-eating animals. This practice of excarnation was deemed necessary so as not to pollute the earth. I'm sure many of you have heard about the towers of silence, or dogmas, on which the dead were exposed. After exposure, the clean bones were gathered and placed in an ossuary, which usually had an opening so that the bones will be in contact with light on the day of resurrection, because Zoroastrians believe that it is then that the remains of the deceased will be made whole again. And here are two views of two complete ossuaries. One is quite elaborately decorated, and the other is a simple clay box in which you can see the skull and the bones. The decorated ossuary was found near Samarkand, Again, you see two priests to either side of the fire altar. One is standing, one is kneeling. And above, on the pyramidal lid, are two young women holding plants, one of which may be the sacred homa, which is most likely ephedra, which is used in Zoroastrian rituals. Above the women are a crescent and kind of a sun disk, a circle, maybe a solar symbol, or the sign of the planet Venus. Such imagery is purely Sogdian. It would never occur in a Zoroastrian context in Sasanian Iran. And not all ossuaries that we have from Sogdiana are so elaborately decorated as the two that we've just looked at, and more typically they're closer to the one on the right. And this one was found near Turfan in Xinjiang, on the northern branch of the Silk Road as it skirts the Taklamakan Desert. It's one of several ossuaries discovered at sites across Xinjiang where not only Sogdians merchants settled, but also craftsmen and farmers. So there were Sogdian communities and other Central Asians living on the various cities along the northern and southern roads of the Taklamakan Desert and then into China. And as we move east into China, so the northern and the southern roads as we pass into China to Dunhuang and then on to the imperial capital of Chang'an today, Xi'an, we have much more evidence of Zoroastrianism and its practice from the tombs of Sogdians and other Central Asians who lived in the different cities across China. They formed their own communities and they established temples. And by the 6th century, Zoroastrianism had gained official Chinese recognition, and it maintained this status into the Tang period. As I had already mentioned, Zoroastrianism, or a form of it, seems to have gained some following among members of the Chinese royal families beginning in the 5th century. The religion appears in Chinese texts as Tian, written in a unique graph that was a way of writing an old dialect pronunciation of the Chinese word for heaven. And we also find references in the text to a fire god, most likely an allusion to the sacred fire and to Ahura Mazda. But this evidence is rather hazy. The Zoroastrian temples and communities of Sogdians and other Central Asians were under the supervision of one of their own, called a sabao, who was appointed by the Chinese government. The tombs and tomb furnishings that we have of these sabaos and other Central Asian elites, specifically the stone sarcophagi and stone beds on which they were buried, show us Zoroastrian, although in this environment more accurately Mazdian practices that we otherwise know only through the Zoroastrian texts. So I'm sure you might be thinking, if the earth is sacred and not to be polluted by dead matter, why do these Zoroastrians or Mazdians have tombs and bury their dead? This is a very intriguing area of speculation on which there's no time to go into depth, except to state that even though these Central Asians assimilated certain Chinese funerary customs, such as a Chinese-style tomb and Chinese-style stone beds, you see one here, and stone sarcophagi, and you see a house-shaped sarcophagus. They depict on their funerary furnishings Zoroastrian funerary rites. And this is what makes the funerary art so valuable for students of Zoroastrianism, because they illustrate specific Zoroastrian or Mazdian rituals and beliefs for which we have no visual documentation in Sogdiana itself or in other parts of Central Asia and Iran. So these are two examples. This one is, it's been reconstructed. It is in the Miho Museum in Japan, and this one was excavated in Xi'an and belonged to the Sabao Shujun, is one of several tombs of various high-ranking personages, sabaos, who chose to be buried, even though they might not have lived in the imperial capital, but they chose to be buried in the imperial capital. Both of them date to the late 6th century, in the time of the Northern Qi and Northern Zhou dynasties. So we'll look at one of the panels on the Miho couch. It's this panel here. And you see in the upper half, in a rocky landscape, a long-robed Zoroastrian priest stands before a fire altar, the lower part of his face covered by the padam. Behind him are 4 men, 2 kneeling and 2 standing, who are holding knives to their heads, and they're cutting their temples and their scalps. Behind them, there are 5 figures standing with downcast eyes and clasped hands. The priest in the center is performing the Afrinagan, the liturgical ceremony of blessing before the sacred fire, in which offerings of flowers and edibles are shared by the worshippers. Beyond these objects, in the upper right, you see 2 women and the hindquarters of 2 camels behind a railing. And I'll return to this part of the composition a bit later. In the lower half of the panel, a group of men and women stand in reverent poses before a tree with 3 saddled horses behind them. The entire scene is one of mourning, and it is actually a very specific mourning ritual described in the Zoroastrian texts, but except for this and one other depiction, which you'll see, it is not found in the art of Zoroastrian Iran or even of Mazdian Sogdiana. We just know about it from the texts. And this ritual is called the Sogdiid. You see right in the center, smack in the center of this relief, is this little dog. The Sogdiid is performed, this ritual is called Sogdiid, which means the viewing by the dog. And it is performed 3 times during the 3 days and nights that span the Zoroastrian funerary ceremony. The dog, regarded by Zoroastrians as a beneficent and righteous animal, is made to look upon the deceased, since its gaze is believed to drive away the evil and polluting spirit of dead matter which tries to attack the dead body. The first Sogdiid is performed immediately after a death. The second is made during the family's watch over the corpse, just before it is removed to the dakma. The third occurs after the funeral procession has reached the dakma, where the dog gives a final glance at the corpse just before it is left as carrion. And here, this is a drawing from another sarcophagus that was found in Shandong, near Shandong in northeastern China, where you see the dog again, and now he's accompanying the sarcophagus, the house-shaped sarcophagus. And this would be a version of the third Sogdiid. It would seem that it would be in opposition to Zoroastrian practice, as the sarcophagus is most likely bearing the body of the deceased, and it's being transported to a tomb rather than to a dakma. Antithetical also to good Zoroastrian practice is the outward display of grief, as evidenced by the men up here on the Miho panel, who are stabbing at their faces. Actually, Zoroastrian texts specifically condemn such demonstrations of grief because it's believed they endanger the soul of the deceased when it tries to cross into paradise. And also, by grieving at all, it brings damnation onto oneself as a mourner. Yet not only on the Miho bed do we find such display, but we find it on ossuaries from Central Asia, as well as on this painting from the Sogdian city of Panjikent in present-day Tajikistan, where you see mourners cutting their faces and tearing their hair and their clothes. Continuing with the funerary ritual, at dawn of the fourth day after death, called Chaharom, the soul of the deceased crosses the bridge of judgment, called the Chinvat Pool, in which can be a very difficult and very dangerous passage. And it's likely that this railing in the upper part of the Miho panel represents the Chinvat Bridge, the camels on it belonging to a caravan that accompanies the deceased, as we know from a fuller representation that we find on one side of the stone sarcophagus from the tomb of the Sabo Shujun that you saw earlier. You see it here. It's a very richly detailed and complex scene, which I show you in a drawing because it's very difficult to see just from the carving. And you see down here is the Chinvat Bridge. Its supports topped by monstrous heads, and the bridge arches over the sea that churns also with other monstrous demonic heads. At the entrance to the bridge, down here at the lower right, 2 Zoroastrian priests perform the service for the fourth day. And shown near them are 2 dogs which guard the bridge. This is all described in the Zoroastrian texts. And these details, as well as other details of the soul's journey after death, we find in the text, and we see it here. They're moving across the bridge. There's a caravan with camels and other beneficent animal species that are deemed appropriate for paradise, led by Shujun and his wife. They have made it to the other side. Their good deeds on earth having outweighed anything that they have done that might be considered bad. Had they not passed this test, which you see being illustrated here on this fragment of an ossuary from near Samarkand, where the god Roshan is seated cross-legged on the bridge, holding the scales in which he weighs the good and the bad deeds of the soul. Had they not passed that test, the bridge would have narrowed like a razor blade, and their souls would have fallen into hell, into the demon-filled waters below. Above the scene is the next stage in Shujun's heavenly ascent, in which he appears before the Sagdian god Vayu Vashpakhar and the welcoming figure of the Dean, who actually represents the totality of a person's thoughts, words, and deeds in life. If these are all good, the Dean greets the soul in the guise of a beautiful woman, as she is depicted here on Shujun's sarcophagus. But if evil has outweighed the good, the Dean appears on the bridge as an ugly hag, and the bridge narrows and the soul journeys ends very badly. We see both aspects of the Dean on this 9th century drawing found in one of the Buddhist caves at Danhuang in northwest China, a site mentioned in Chinese texts as having a significant Zoroastrian temple. And you see 2 female divinities. The one on the left is holding a dish in which there is a dog, which we know is a beneficent animal, and the lady on the right sits on a wolf, which in the Zoroastrian text is considered a noxious creature. Time does not permit a full reading of the symbolism incorporated by the clothing, headdresses, and other attributes of these 2 figures, but I'd like you to note the wide open eyes of the good Dean on the left, which conveys the notion of the mutual vision of the individual soul and the Dean, as expressed in the Middle Persian formula, "May I see the soul." The half-closed eyes of her counterpart are in contrast and illustrate the contempt which Zoroastrian texts attribute to the bad Dean. The Zoroastrian paradise to which Shujun and his wife journey is called the abode of song, a place of feasting and music. And here you're looking at a paradise scene from another sarcophagus, that of a Central Asian dignitary called Yu Hong, which was found near the northern Chinese city of Taiyuan. In the center, seated in a pavilion on a platform, Yu Hong and his wife, surrounded, they're feasting, surrounded by haloed musicians, by heavenly musicians, and in front of them, a man dances on an oval carpet in what the Chinese called the Sogdian whirl, the Hushuan Wu. This characteristically Sogdian dance illustrates another aspect of Zoroastrianism, or Mazdaism to be more precise, that we find along the Silk Road, the role of music and dance as a part of religious ritual. On the left, you see an ossuary from Sogdiana showing girls dancing and one playing the harp. In a funerary context, this seems antithetical to Zoroastrian belief and practice, but we have Chinese reports of such dancing, religious and secular. The Chinese were fascinated by it, actually, and flocked to Zoroastrian temples to see the ritual dancing that took place as part of, apparently, the Central Asian Mazdian ceremonies, ritual. The two men twirling and prancing on the pair of doors on the right come from a family tomb in northwest China, illustrating this kind of dance. And this whirl was one of the claims to fame of the part Sogdian general An Lushan, a favorite of the Tang emperor, until he led the rebellion of 755 CE that nearly toppled the dynasty. But until then, he would entertain the court with his ability to do the Sogdian whirl, despite weighing more than 400 pounds. And this type of dancing may actually be somehow the antecedent to the dancing of the Sufi dancing, of the whirling. And there are Sufi orders in Central Asia that may be a direct outgrowth from this Sogdian ritual dancing. After An Lushan's rebellion, the foreign community suffered, and in 845, Zoroastrianism became one of the religions prescribed by the Chinese government. But there remain a few references to Zoroastrianism temples as late as the 12th century. So, to conclude, many of the concepts of Zoroastrianism that I presented had great resonance along the Silk Road. Although it was a minority religion in China, where it was practiced mainly by Central Asians residing there, it was the main religion of the pre-Islamic Iranian world, and thus of that great expanse that constituted the Silk Road across Western and Eastern Central Asia. And although Zoroastrianism now is only a minority religion, many of its concepts are widespread, such as its belief in a transhistorical Messiah, in heaven and hell, in a day of judgment, and the ultimate resurrection of those who have died. And most of these beliefs seem to have been current as early as the 5th century BCE. So it's very likely that they influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, 3 of the 4 other religions of the Silk Road that we've looked at today. Thank you.
Thanks to Judith, and thanks to all of our speakers for 4 wonderful journeys, religious journeys along the Silk Road. At this point, I invite questions about Zoroastrianism, but if you have additional questions about Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or Buddhism, those would also be welcome. After you. Please.
I believe you said that the Sasanian Zoroastrian is very different than the Sogdian Zoroastrianism, and all of our documents basically come from the Sogdian side.
Sasanian Iran.
Oh, Sasanian.
When we talk about Zoroastrianism and what we know about it.
I'm sorry. Use the microphone
Sure.
and repeat.
The question was really the difference between Sasanian Zoroastrianism and Zoroastrianism among the Sogdians. When we talk about, this is a real problem, when we talk about Zoroastrianism, we're really referring to Zoroastrianism as known historically in Sasanian Iran, where it was the state religion. It was a highly centralized state. And And so we have texts. We have very little visual evidence of Zoroastrianism in practice. And I mean, we have fire altars, and you saw we have images of some of the deities, such as Ahura Mazda investing the kings. But interestingly, some of the practices that we read about and know about in the text and are also practiced by Zoroastrians today, such as the Sagdid, we only really see in Central Asia and specifically in China. And given with that, I was showing the Sagdid ceremony, which we know is practiced by Zoroastrians, whether in Central Asia or in Iran. But this showing signs of mourning, tearing of the hair, stabbing the scalp, this is forbidden in the Zoroastrian text, and yet this is a Zoroastrian ritual, funerary ritual that we're observing. So there's much more, Zoroastrianism is much more complex and varied across this region of Iran into Central Asia, into China.
And I would add that the Sagdi practice in Bombay, where there's Towers of Science, I used to live in that neighborhood, and a very different interpretation of the the Parsi neighborhood around the Nandi Chowk is that very different interpretation of the role of the dog at the time of death. And so that the dog identifies if the body is in a coma or actually dead.
Yeah, so that's the whole idea.
Which is very